what is happening is that you're seeing both sides going hell for leather at the moment. And I think that's where that offensive, Ukraine's kind of renewed effort in Kursk comes. It's what we're seeing the Russians attempting to do around Kharkiv and towards Pokrovsk. And it's also what we're seeing with Ukraine's strikes on the oil refineries and the targets. And today, possibly a targeted assassination. We're not clear in Moscow, reports just emerging. All of this is about trying to grab momentum and to convince each side's backers. I think Moscow is trying to convince its perhaps backers, the generals, its own population to some extent. Ukraine's certainly trying to convince the West that it's still in this fight and it can still make a real difference, that it isn't a foregone conclusion. Because I'm sure you felt this as well. There's this constantly calcifying myth, and I think it is a myth, but that Russia is unbeatable. That Russia's victory is inevitable. And what was in many ways refreshing about that Kursk offensive was it shattered that myth. It reminded the world that Russia can and has been defeated on the battlefield. And we've seen that on a few occasions during this conflict. We saw it soon after the initial invasion when they rolled back from Kyiv, when the Russians retreated from Kyiv. We saw it that first autumn when the front lines collapsed around Kharkiv, and then we saw it in the south in Kherson with the advent of GMLRS and HIMARS missiles. Ukraine was able to cut the supply lines, Russian supply lines to Kherson, and the Russians retreated. But since October 2023, which was the sort of end of Ukraine's first summer counteroffensive, to be honest, more or less since then, with the exception of that Kursk operation, Russia has had the initiative. That means Russia has been setting the pace for this conflict. Certainly the infantry battle, the trench battle, the armoured infantry battle, but the war, the hot war as we imagine it, with soldiers, guns, tanks and artillery that's taking place inside Ukraine. And that is a challenge for Ukraine because they're always responding to those, right, more or less always responding to those Russian attacks. Where Ukraine has maintained the initiative has been outside its sovereign territory, at least not on the land. So we've seen it in the sea, in the Crimea, in the Black Sea, rather. They've fought an astonishing campaign to force Russia's Black Sea fleet eastwards, and it's worth remembering how effective that's been. Russia has effectively had to retreat. Its Black Sea fleet has had to retreat to the eastern edge of the Black Sea, and we see it almost every day. I'd say probably every second night for most of January, certainly. We saw these long-range strikes, and we've seen them against two sets of targets, more or less. There's been the oil infrastructure, both depots and refineries, and that's what's been going on in January, a real attempt to degrade Russia's infrastructure to limit its ability to prosecute the war, because if Russia can't fuel its troops, its aircraft, then it's going to find it harder to fight. And we've also seen it hitting weapons factories and ammunition dumps. A sort of different branch, but clearly achieving the same goal, which is degrading Russia's ability to prosecute this conflict. And to some extent, it has worked. At one point, the ratio of fires across the front line was at least 10-1. So for every shell that Ukraine could fire across the front line, Russia was firing 10 back. But subsequent to a particularly spectacular strike towards the end of last year against an ammunition depot where a lot of that North Korean artillery ammunition was being stored, the fires ratios dropped, we think, to about 4-1, according to a briefing I had from Western officials. So it is working, but is it enough? Not at the moment, because Russia is still advancing. And a question I get asked a lot is who is winning? And it's a really good question because it's really simple and it really cuts through all of that noise that I was talking about earlier. And the truth is, right now, Russia is winning. We can't ignore that. We can't turn away from that. Russia is winning. But what I would say to people who ask that question, and especially to people who are potentially downhearted by that, people who want Ukraine to successfully resist Russia, is that the course of conflict is not always, in fact, not often linear. And I'd give two examples. Britain and the Allies were losing World War II until 1943, when the tide really started to turn. And that wasn't just because America had come in. America had come in, 18 months earlier, but really it was when the Allies, defeated Rommel in North Africa and then managed to invade Italy. And the other one I would point out was a war that we didn't win. But it was the war in Afghanistan that very sadly Britain and its allies, I think, absolutely lost. But in 2001, Britain and predominantly America totally destroyed or totally defeated the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime collapsed, and for many years it appeared like a new alternative was taking hold in Afghanistan, but all of that has been undone. So, it can look like you're winning for a long time, but that doesn't mean the outcome is a foregone conclusion.
And are there not some serious structural long-term weaknesses for Russia, and in particular the Russian economy? I mean, you've got the ruble now back to around 110 against the dollar, very weak. You got inflation back up around about 10%, and we know that they've been reliant on oil revenues and the shadow fleet. But with Donald Trump saying we're going to ramp up domestic oil production in the US, if this is still a hot war in a year's time, things could be coming to a real crunch point for the Russian economy, could they not?
I think they could be. I think they likely are coming to a crunch point. I think we have to be careful. It's always tempting to think Russia's on the brink of collapse. In terms of, I don't want Russia to collapse in one sense. I don't wish ill on the Russian people, but it's tempting, certainly in terms of wanting them to not be able to prosecute this war, to think that the economy will collapse and they'll be forced to call off their murderous invasion. The economy is clearly running hot. You're right. Inflation at over 20%. All of this, 40% of the annual budget being invested in security and defence. These are figures which appear to be totally unsustainable. And a couple of the analogies I was reading last week, one person suggested that it was the economy on steroids, sustainable for a certain amount of time, but steroids have side effects. Somebody else suggested it was like a party goer on cocaine. There is going to be a come down. When that come down happens, of course, is what's all important. And for the time being, Moscow is sustaining it. And so long as, and that is, I think, Russia's main strategy, is to outlast Ukraine and to outlast the West. It's an attritional conflict. So they are suffering pain, or at least they're building up, they're storing up pain in terms of this economic calamity which may yet befall them. But they're prepared to do that. So they're soaking that up for the future. And they're also in real terms now suffering huge losses on a daily basis. But again, they're prepared to suffer that pain now and in the future to achieve their goals. And the calculation that Moscow is making is that we, the West and Ukraine, are unable or unwilling to suffer or endure that pain as long as they are. And as long as they can outlast us. If they can outlast us one day, then as far as they're concerned, it's worth it because they'll win.
Jerome, this has been absolutely fascinating. We could talk to you for hours. We don't have long left. So just briefly, I'm going to throw a few kind of quick fire-ish questions at you.
Go for your life.
Each of them deserve a lot more length and discussion, but just if you can keep your answers brief, that'd be great. First of all, do you think that European countries are going to have to just face reality and increase their defence budgets?
Yes.
Do you think Donald Trump will be able to deliver some kind of peace negotiations in the first 100 days of his administration?
Some kind of peace negotiations, yes. I think the most likely outcome is an awkward freeze, but I think that will be fragile and potentially unsustainable.
And finally, will this still be a hot war by the end of 2025?
I hope and pray not, but hope, as we all know, is not a strategy. I think, in all likelihood, probably yes.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, James Hansen. For more on the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts, you can subscribe or sign up for a membership for exclusive videos. And you can also get the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or from thetimes.com.